Hi, this is Miss Ball, and this is part 2 of the Chapter 4 PowerPoint. And we are picking up where we left off with part 1. And we want to talk about keystone species. Some species have an unusually large effect in a community, and we call those keystone species. So much like an architectural keystone at the top of an arch, a community may collapse if the keystone species is removed. So you should be familiar with a few examples of keystone species. Pause the video and take a few minutes to read through these. There's some on this slide and there's some on the next slide. And you should jot down a few examples from them and be able to kind of explain why they're keystone species. I would recommend you choose at least one that's kind of one that we would find in Kansas, one that's native here, such as beavers or hummingbirds would be a good one. Here are a few more. Prairie dogs would be a great one to be familiar with. So sometimes a change at one trophic level can have an extreme ripple effect on others, and that's the case of the extermination of wolves. Wolves are an apex predator or top predator. And when they were exterminated, that leads to too many deer, too much damage to the vegetation, and really changes the nature of the whole forest. So we call that ripple effect from the top down a trophic cascade. In a famous study, an ecologist named Payne went along a shoreline and physically removed all of the starfish of a certain species and watched to see what would happen in that community. He saw a surge in some species and a decrease in other species, and this was a great example of the influence of a keystone species. So this graph shows that overall, when a keystone species is removed, biodiversity is going to decrease as a whole. The same thing has been observed with sea otters when they're removed. Their food source, the sea urchin, will increase, and they cause great damage to the kelp forest. So the otters help keep that balance in the community. So add this to your notes. Indicator species are not discussed in your textbook, but they are species that are sensitive typically to environmental change, and they may signal a change in the environment or tell us something about the quality of an ecosystem. And so for us, when we can go out in the spring and do stream sampling, we look for little things in the water that we call macroinvertebrates. Those could be immature insects or mollusks or larvae or snails. And the presence or absence of certain species can tell us about the pollution levels in the water, how clear the water is. Overall, we have a cool little scoring chart that we use to rate the quality of the water based on what macroinvertebrates are present. So they're a great example of indicator species. Resistance is a measure of how stable a community is when there's a disturbance. Resilience is the ability of a community to bounce back after there has been a disturbance. Sometimes disturbances can cause permanent change. Succession is change in a community after a disturbance. So there are two categories we're going to talk about. Primary succession is really extreme. It's when the disturbance is so great that all life and all vegetation is removed. So that would be something really drastic, like the explosion of a volcano or something not natural. Maybe a field got paved over with a parking lot. And primary succession is when species start to come back and take over that area and to recolonize it. So think of like a crack in the pavement and weeds starting to pop up. Or in the case of the picture I showed you of the volcano that I took in the Galapagos, there was a little cactus that was poking its way up through the lava called a lava cactus. And it's an example of a pioneer species, which is one of those first organisms that can go into an area and start to make it hospitable for other species. Lichen are a great example of this because they will break rock down into soil so that plants can come in and establish themselves. Secondary succession is much more common. It's when there's disturbance, but not all living organisms are destroyed. So this could be if there's a fire or if the forest had been logged and certain trees had been removed. Add this to your notes, the yellow highlighted item. Succession in a disturbed ecosystem will affect the total biomass, species richness, and net productivity over time. Biomes are terms for communities of organisms typically characterized by the plants that live there and the vegetation structure. They're also characterized by abiotic factors such as weather patterns, so climate. And hopefully you learned about biomes before, maybe in biology or in another, maybe even in middle school. And so I'm going to click through these biomes, and I'd like you to just kind of look at the slide and see if there are any terms that are unfamiliar to you, or if there's some biomes that you're not as familiar with. So for example, for temperate deciduous forest, make sure that you know that the word deciduous means seasonal. So these are trees that don't keep their leaves year round. They drop them in the fall. Next is temperate grasslands, which is where we live. This is our biome. And another name for prairie is steppe. So if we're talking about Asia, they're going to call their prairie steppe. Temperate rainforest is found on the coastal Pacific Northwest part of the United States, including places like Washington State. Tropical rainforest is going to be found near the equator. Savanna is another type of grassland. Desert, of course, is characterized by extremely low precipitation. Tundra is known for its permafrost, which is melting now because of climate change. Boreal forest is a term that can be used interchangeably with the more indigenous word taiga. So make sure you know both of those terms. Chaparral can also be called shrubland, and it's kind of the most famous shrubland in the U.S. is that found in California. So moving up in altitude can have the same effect as traveling northward in latitude. So it can be kind of like traveling out of your biome. And note that we talked a little bit in geology, our geology unit, about how the abiotic surface of the earth, the rocks and the formations on the earth can influence what life can live there. So a mountain would be a great example of that, because when the air goes over the mountain, that causes what we call a rain shadow effect, creating different weather patterns. So in conclusion, there's a lot of information in this chapter about ecologies and species interactions. So focus on the parts that are new to you or less familiar to you as you study.